Encounter is brought to you by the Broome County Council of Churches, where we connect compassion with needs as we inspire growth with dignity. You'll find us in special places throughout the community. For those who remain hungry, we provide meals. For those who are challenged, we build wheelchair ramps. We comfort those who are ill, minister to those who are confined, and we remain an advocate for change and understanding on behalf of every element of our community. Connect and inspire. Encounter the Broome County Council of Churches.
Brothers and sisters, welcome to the Encounter program sponsored by the Broome County Council of Churches. I'm your host, Mark Kimpland, the pastor at the Endwell United Methodist Church. I've been hosting the Encounter program for a number of years, and I've always wanted to do a program like this today. I've always wanted to have a dialogue and a conversation with a colleague who isn't retired yet, but is so close that they can taste it, and just kind of pick their brain and see their spirit and have them discuss their years in ministry, the things that they've learned, the lessons they've learned, their hopes for the future. And so I want to dive right into the program, as I am blessed, as I know that you will be blessed also, to introduce our guest, who is no stranger to the Encounter program, the Reverend Dr. David Kofahl, the Binghamton District Superintendent of the Upper New York Conference. Dave, welcome back.
It's good to be back, Mark.
Yes, it is. That's quite a title you got there.
Yeah, it's a long one. Yeah.
I am so glad to have you with us, and we sit here in the Endwell United Methodist Church, just merely weeks before your official retirement.
That's right.
In ministry. And I just want to take this time to kind of dive into, just talk about lessons learned and maybe some things over 40 plus years of ministry. But let's start here. That might be good for our listeners and viewers. Can you take me back a ways? Let's start first with the call. Can you just kind of hit on that just for a moment, just
Sure.
Because that was the moment that
Right.
enabled the next. So could you just share with us your call?
It was a process because I'm third generation pastor in my family, and so I grew up in the parsonage. I was a preacher's kid at 5 years old because my dad was an aeronautical engineer before he became pastor. So I wasn't born into it, but I became one. Of course, then my dad was a preacher's kid too, because my grandfather was a pastor in the a former evangelical church and the former Methodist church, and so I've always felt I've stood on that legacy. And one of the defining moments of my life was when I was 4 months old. My grandfather baptized me in his church in Buffalo, and he died 2 months later. And so that's had a huge impact on my life. And even though I wasn't aware at the time, that's always been a defining moment. So the sacrament of baptism has been a huge thing in my life. And with that real personal sense, because I was the only grandchild he would have ever seen. And so I've often felt that if there's a family legacy, which I don't believe in, but if there is, I felt if something was passed on there when I was 4 months old. Right. And because the call for myself was complex, because I remember the first inkling was because my dad was a second career pastor. I kind of remember his process. He finished college, he went to seminary, I remember his ordination as elder, and it was in where you were, where you pastored just before this.
Oh, Fulton.
In Fulton.
Yeah,
it was the former Fulton, the bigger church.
The Alliance Church.
When
yes.
the old Northern New York Conference used to meet there.
Yes.
And it was in that ordination service that I remember my dad was called up. Of course, in those days, the mostly wives in those days knelt with the ordinands. Okay. And I remember a little whisper going back between my dad and the bishop, who was Bishop Ward at that time. Okay. And all of a sudden I heard Bishop Ward say, "And would David come up too?" And so I'm an only child, so I was always in on everything.
Yes.
And so my first inklings was at that annual conference when I was about 10 years old. That swiftly got jammed away because throughout most of my experience being a preacher's kid, that's the last thing I was going to do. But the inklings started, and going to a Christian college, Houghton College, there were a couple of spiritual emphasis weeks where the call really started to crystallize as my faith really started to gel in a more, in a real live way. And so it was a process. I can't say totally kicking and screaming, but it was pretty much settled by the end of my freshman year of college.
Okay.
And so it happened in stages.
Yeah. Now that legacy that you speak of and such things was, I'm sure at times it was a blessing, at times it was a curse. It was, I mean,
Exactly.
How did you carry that? I mean, how did you deal with that?
I think the hardest part was in those days, pastors moved a lot more.
Yeah.
And I moved halfway between fifth grade, and I moved between seventh and eighth grade, which I think is the hardest time to move for any preacher's kid who is in middle school or junior high school at that time. That's a really tough age. And but my best move was, my dad was in a small church in West Barre in Orleans County, and he moved right into Albion, which is the county seat of, and that was halfway through my senior year, but it was the same school district.
Oh, okay.
And so I went from becoming a bus rider to a townie, and I could get up a whole hour later. That was positive.
The blessings of ministry.
And Dad was in that church through my college and seminary years, and when Diane and I got married and all of that. So I think the moving was the hardest part, and then sometimes there were expectations laid on preachers' kids which I would rebel against, and my dad protected me from. But so there was good and bad, but mostly, I would say mostly good.
Okay. So can you take me back to that first time, that first Sunday, or that first appointment that you had, that you, I kind of go back there every once in a while, just in my mind, to that holy, sacred moment where your name's on the sign now.
Right.
Can you kind of share a little bit about that experience?
I will say that I didn't become a pastor of a church. And I had done some preaching, but I was not a student pastor in college or seminary. As a preacher's kid, I kind of knew what I was getting into.
Yeah.
But I remember standing in the kitchen window of our parsonage in Olean, just down the Southern Tier Expressway, on the other side of the Southern Tier, and looking over to that stone church over there. I said, "I'm pastor of that church." Gulp. It was one thing being the preacher's kid, another thing being the preacher. And I remember the first sermon went okay, but there was a defining moment that first year. I'm not exactly sure when. I think it was that first summer. But I remember I was sitting at my desk in my office, and I was kind of sort of freaking out a little bit. And this overwhelming sense came, and it wasn't audible, but it was about as close to audible as of God speaking to me I could imagine. It was that I really felt that overwhelming sense that, Dave, you're exactly where I want you to be. And I've never doubted since then. Now, have I had up and downs since then? Absolutely. But I would say that was a really defining moment early in my ministry, and gave me the confidence to grow and to evolve into a more effective pastor.
So what is, can you kind of take us through that journey? I'm interested in hearing that. You shared 41 years in active ministry, 43 years since your ordination and such things. So that, what was the progress? What were the churches that you served as you went through that 41 years? Can you just kind of give us a thumbnail sketch of those places and spaces that you served? Sure.
I was ordained deacon back in the day when we had a twofold ordination.
Very well.
I was ordained deacon after my first year of seminary. I was 2 months shy of being 23 when I was ordained deacon, and finished out next 2 years of seminary and started my first church in 1979. And I was assigned to Olean Showers United Methodist Church, which was a former Evangelical United Brethren Church. There's a lot more of those in Western New York than there are in this area. And it was really a really perfect church. I graduated from seminary. Diane and I were expecting our first child. What a great way to start ministry.
Yes.
And because every church loves a pastor with a baby or a baby on the way. And Diane was able to fill in as music director and organist and all of that. And so we became a team right off. And I think you and Lynn have some identification with that.
Yes,
But that was a wonderful first church for us. And a year later, I was doing so well, the DS added another church, a little church called Trinity Church in Knapp Creek, which is up Rock City Hill, almost on the Pennsylvania line, south of Olean. And so out of my 8 years in Olean, I had a 2-point charge in the last 7. So I went from one church to two. But both churches had their own unique personalities, and it was a great experience. And all 3 of our children were born in St. Francis Hospital in Olean, which no longer exists. And so Olean holds a real special place for Diane and I. That was the first house we really lived in, because we were married in seminary housing, especially in those days. It's not the nice housing they have in seminary now. But it was just in Kentucky, in first 2 years without air conditioning in Kentucky, were
beautiful,
pretty hot.
Beautiful.
But so we were there for 8 years, and then my next ministry was at St. James United Methodist Church in Niagara Falls, and I was there for 16 years. And that's where ministry evolved. And I remember talking to my friends saying, isn't it great to come into a church with experience? So I had 8 years experience, and of course all my preacher's kid experience also tied in too, helped a lot. But when we went to Niagara Falls, it was a much bigger church, very active church, and it was a challenge. And in those 16 years, I had to continue to evolve, because one of the secrets I've always shared with pastors, especially young pastors, the secret to longevity in a congregation, Mark, I think you know this too, is that you have to keep reinventing yourself. You have to keep pushing the church into new things and to new emphases, and for yourself to grow and for the church to grow. And that's one of the real life lessons. And because I remember I was raised with through seminary, our teaching was very traditional worship and all that kind of thing. And we had great traditional worship going on, and great service, and packed out. And but some of our younger ones, it wasn't cutting it for them anymore. And I remember one of my very close friends handed me this book called Beyond Playing Church, by Mike Slaughter, one of our longtime United Methodist pastors. It was renamed Spiritual Entrepreneurs later on. And his whole ministry, he introduced contemporary worship and all of that, and how that evolved. And he's kind of different kind of guy to begin with. And that started revolutionizing my thinking. And the more I read, the more I thought, after so many years, I got to go back to seminary again. And I was very fortunate during my time in Niagara Falls to go back to my seminary, Asbury Seminary in Kentucky, and I was privileged to be in their Beeson Pastor program, which was a complete scholarship fellowship program on the doctorate ministry level. And it was all about church health, church growth, biblical preaching, and in that program, we visited the largest churches in the world, largest churches in this country, and I found out why large churches are large churches. And there's very good reasons.
Not by accident, yes.
Not by accident, because they are focused, they know what they believe, they know what their purpose is, to reach people for Jesus and to make disciples. Not a complicated formula. And that's something that, as I saw how the mega churches operated, and they're mega churches because they're friendly, they're focused, and there are many ways for people to tie in. And I tried to bring that back to my church in Niagara Falls, and made many mistakes doing that too. Many mistakes introducing contemporary worship.
Okay.
And but we made sure that we had two very different services, and so that's something that evolved through 16 years of ministry. So that by the time another appointment came along, and that was probably the hardest decision of my life, because I had pastored in Niagara Falls for, let's see, we were there 16 years. I was there for about 14 years or so, went to school, then I did another 3 years. And after the end of the 3 years, the cabinet came to me saying, Dave, we have another appointment for you. And I was not ready to leave Niagara Falls because I felt we were really cranking.
Right.
And by that, maybe we were at a point where perhaps a change would be good. And I made sure the other church, which was Clarence United Methodist Church in suburban Buffalo, I said, if I come, we're going to do contemporary worship, and you're going to support me in that.
Bring it with me.
And if not, it's nice knowing you.
Yes. I'm
going to stay where I am. And they said, no, we want that. That's what we want. And but we went through some growing pains those first couple of years. And I know what the worship wars of the 90s were like, because I went through that in Niagara Falls, and much more successful. I avoided some of the pitfalls in Clarence. So we spent 10 very good years in Clarence before I got another call that really freaked me out when the bishop's office called and said, Bishop Webb would like to talk to you. And I thought, oh boy, I know what that is. And sure enough, he offered me the appointment as Binghamton District Superintendent. And that was a decision that was not hard to make. Although I said as a younger pastor, I always said to Diane, if I ever accept that job, take me out in the backyard and shoot me.
Yes.
And we had that conversation several times.
Kind of came back around. Yeah.
But by the time I got to a later stage in my ministry, I was more ready for it.
Okay.
And it was a pretty obvious answer, yes. And it was pretty obvious that this was the direction that God wanted me to go. And so that was one of my easier decisions, believe it or not.
Okay.
And here I've been for 7 years, and it's a testimony of how fast 7 years go. And we move 5 weeks from tomorrow, so not that I'm counting.
No, who's counting?
Officially done June 30th, but we move June 15th. So
Awesome. Friends, we are here on the Encounter program with David Kofahl, the District Superintendent of the Binghamton District of the Upper New York Conference, who's sharing his journey of ministry that spanned over 4 decades. Here's an interesting question. I appreciate that timeline, with all of its challenges and triumphs and all of that. Is there, I always like to ask this question, let's say that there's someone listening, watching to the show today that's maybe pondering their call, or maybe he's just in ministry, or they're just getting started. They're don't have the first 5 years. Is there words of wisdom, something that you would share with them for their journey about being in ministry? The important things they need to know, things they can hang their spiritual hat on that you've learned over your 40 plus years.
Well, I will go back to my experience as a preacher's kid, and some of those early inklings that I mentioned when my dad was ordained, and then later high school and early college when I was really feeling the call. And it was interesting. My dad had a very interesting response to that. I knew he was proud, no question. But the pointed question he made is this really what God is calling you to do? Is this your personal call? Because I'm third generation. My son is fourth generation serving as a pastor. It's not a family franchise thing.
Well
people.
Put.
It makes a nice joke and it's a nice story.
Yeah, well put.
But it's not a franchise thing. It's an individual call. And if it happens that a child of the next generation picks up the call, well, or is called by God, that's a whole thing. But so first of all, really be sure that you are called by God. Be sure this is the thing that God is laying on your heart and is showing you in many different ways. Sometimes it's affirmation to people, but that's not always the key. Because, there's always grandma or auntie say, oh, you should be a preacher. And no, you shouldn't.
No.
and because unless you're called, I will say ministry will eat you alive. Because there are many dealing with people. I remember one of my dad's struggles going from engineering to ministry. Aeronautical engineering is formulas and science and figures, but when it comes to people are people. They're variable.
Yes, they are.
And that's quite an adjustment.
Yes.
And so, number one, make sure it's God's call. Because I've seen so many people who are in ministry that really shouldn't be in various positions, whether it's a superintendent or whether it's serving on a board of ordained ministry, which credentials ministers. There's some people that are passed on that we should be more honest and say, you're called of God, to be a child of God and to serve God, but not in
this capacity.
pastoral ministry, right?
Yeah. As you reflect back, this is intriguing. What's been your biggest challenge in ministry? I know that's kind of a subjective kind of a question, but just kind of looking back, what were some of the, whether they be personal challenges or professional challenges or family challenges, or can you flag any of those that might provide comfort for someone who's kind of moving through this?
I find my biggest challenge has been myself.
Okay.
And the biggest challenge has been, what is the next thing I should do? Mm-hmm. Where is God leading me or pushing me to do? And I was more of a person that had to be pushed and sometimes whacked to get to the next step.
Okay.
My wife Diane can testify to that.
Okay.
And I will say too, most of my best ideas have come from her and other friends, and you know what that's like too. But I think the biggest challenge is to continue to grow. Unless you're continuing to grow in your faith, unless you're continuing to draw closer to God in Jesus Christ, and continuing to grow as a person in all of those ways, you're going to flounder. Yeah. And again, it's like the secret to being a long-term pastor in a church. You need to keep reinventing. Yes. And you need to keep listening to where God is leading, because our culture is changing, everything is changing, and we've seen in the last 2 months how one virus can change everything and also change ministry. And when I reflect on 40 years of ministry, how much our world and culture and everything has changed, it's amazing. Yeah. And so it's not that you change with the culture, but you need to adapt to the culture in ministry. Because I think the Word of God is the Word of God, and I think God's message is the same as it was 2,000 years ago. But you've got to change how you get the message out to reach people. So that's the challenge.
Yeah. So here you are, some 40 years later, and we have about 2 minutes left or so to wrap up. I could do this for another 3 shows. In about 2 minutes, what's your hope for the church? I mean, here we are in the middle of a pandemic. Here we are, and as you said very eloquently, in a much different world than when we were ordained and such things. In a few minutes, can you share your hope for the church?
My hope for the church is that we really reclaim the basics. I've been reading a book written by a friend about circuit riders. Mm-hmm. And the old Methodist circuit riders went through hell in their ministry. Yeah. They had to fight the frontier, the elements of frontier. Frontier people were not easy to reach. They were rugged people. They were coarse people. They were violent people, and they had to ride on horses, traveling thousands of miles in these circuits. But the one thing that's consistent through every circuit rider, they loved Jesus with a passion. They knew who they were. They knew their call, and their biggest purpose was to win souls for Jesus Christ. That was their passion. That was the passion of the early camp meetings. That was the purpose of the early camp meetings, and that's how people were won. People who had no desire to know God, to come to Christ, were converted through the ministry of these people, and it was their passion. And I think that I wish our denomination, the United Methodist Church, would bring back that passion. But as churches get settled, they get started, theology gets sophisticated to the point where it takes the soul out of Scripture. I think that we need that. There's a reason why our United Methodist Church is divided. And that we need to claim the gospel. We need to claim the Bible as God's holy word, as the inspired word of God. And people wonder why community churches are growing and other churches are growing, because they're focused. And we need to regain that focus. That's my hope for our denomination, and my hope for the church in general is that we stay focused on the gospel, but we continue to adapt to how the culture needs to hear it. And that's my hope.
Amen. Yes. And I appreciate, Dave, I just want to take a minute, because we only have a moment left, to thank you for your commitment to the love of Jesus Christ. And 40 plus years, and I thank God that you were a part of my life and the lives of so many people all over, everywhere.
That's been the joy of being a superintendent in the Binghamton district,
Yes.
Which basically covers Tioga and Broome County, a little bit of Shenango, but has been able to touch the lives of pastors. And
thank you for doing so.
That's been it.
I appreciate it. Friends, we have had the honor to be with David Kofahl, the district superintendent of the Binghamton district of the Upper New York Conference. Friends, have a wonderful day. May God bless you as we take this journey together. Have a wonderful week.